You know exactly what he is. You left, and yet he's still there. Every morning, same loop. The thoughts arrive on their own, uninvited, fully formed, like something in you never got the message that it was over. And here's what nobody tells you. There are 3 layers to why that happens. The third one changes everything you thought you understood about your own mind. Before we go deeper, if this kind of content reaches you at the right moment, the subscription is worth something. The YouTube algorithm only keeps showing you the next layer if you signal that you want to see more. And in the next layers, this gets genuinely uncomfortable, in a way that actually helps. Here's something I keep coming back to. A few months after my divorce, I was 41, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Asheville that felt about 3 times too quiet. I noticed something strange. There was one specific argument with my ex-wife that kept surfacing. Not all the fights. Not the end of things, just that one conversation, the one where she said something I hadn't expected, in a tone I hadn't heard from her before. I'd be driving to the store or making coffee or standing in the shower, and suddenly I was back in that kitchen, fully there, seeing the light coming through the window over the sink, hearing her voice, and every time I'd try to reason my way out of it. I'd say to myself, that's done. That's 3 years ago. You've processed this. Move on, it didn't work. What made it worse, what I didn't admit to anyone for a long time, was that I was a grief counselor. I had spent 12 years sitting beside dying people, helping families navigate the most impossible losses of their lives. I knew about rumination. I knew about intrusive thoughts. I knew the clinical language for what happens when the mind loops. I had used that language with patience. And still, that kitchen kept coming back. I remember one afternoon I was driving up toward the Black Mountain area, the way the Blue Ridge gets wider and quieter out there, and the thought surfaced again. That argument, that tone of her voice, and I pulled over, actually pulled over, because I was tired of fighting it while driving. I sat there for 20 minutes, not trying to analyze it, not trying to push it away, just sitting with it. And what I noticed was that the memory wasn't interested in logic. I could point out to myself with complete accuracy every reason that conversation didn't matter anymore. And the memory looked right through the argument. That's the first thing to understand about where we're going today. This isn't about weakness. This isn't about failing to move on. The people I sat with in hospice, people who had lived full, long lives, people who had done the inner work, people who had made peace with almost everything, sometimes in their final weeks, they'd bring up a person who had wronged them 30 years earlier, still vivid, still unresolved, still there, a grievance that had traveled decades inside them, as present in the body as the day it formed. One woman I sat with, she was 79, a retired school teacher, the most even-tempered person I'd met in that ward, spent the last 2 weeks of her life talking about a man she'd been engaged to in her 20s, who had left without explanation. 50 years. She had married someone else, had children, had what looked from the outside like a complete life. And yet there he was, at the end. That's not weakness either. That's something else. And Jung had a name for it, but wait. That's not where layer 1 starts. Layer 1 starts with what you've probably already tried. You've probably done some version of this. You told yourself the facts. You listed what he did. You named the patterns, the gaslighting, the hot and cold, the way he made you feel unreliable in your own perception. You talked to friends until they stopped having new things to say about it. Maybe you talked to a therapist, you read the articles, you watched the videos. You understand intellectually, completely, that what happened was toxic and that you're better off without him. You know this the way you know your own phone number. And yet knowing it changed almost nothing about what happens inside you at 3 a.m. The thoughts still come. Your body still reacts when you hear a song that was playing the first time you realize you were in trouble, or drive past a restaurant where a good night happened, or catch yourself wondering, even now, months later, what he's doing tonight. Whether he's thought about you, whether the person he's with now is getting the version of him that you only glimpsed occasionally. And somewhere underneath all of that knowing, there's this quiet, corrosive thought, if I really understood that it was bad, if I were really over it, this would have stopped by now. The fact that it hasn't stopped means something is wrong with me. That's the layer 1 belief. And it's the one we need to dismantle first, because here's what's actually happening. In the early 1900s, Carl Jung was working with word association experiments at the Berghelsli Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich. He'd say a word, table, night, father, and measure not just what the patient said in response, but how long it took them to respond. He measured reaction time to the fraction of a second, and he kept noticing something that couldn't be explained by the standard models of the time. Certain words produced delays, hesitations, changed breathing, flushing of the face. The patient would change the subject or give an answer that didn't quite fit, or suddenly go blank and need the word repeated. The words that did this weren't random, they clustered. They formed constellations around specific charged areas of the person's inner life, areas the person might not have consciously identified as significant. Jung called what he found a complex. Not complex as in complicated, complex as in a constellation, a grouping of psychic contents that orbit around what he called a nuclear element. The nuclear element is always emotionally charged. It forms because a real experience, something that actually happened, combined with an innate psychological disposition to create what Jung described in his collected works, Volume 8, as the image of a psychic situation that is strongly accentuated emotionally and, crucially, incompatible with the habitual attitude of consciousness. Read that last phrase again. Incompatible with the habitual attitude of consciousness. That's the diagnostic key. A complex doesn't live in the part of you that reasons. It doesn't live where the logic is. It lives in a place the will cannot easily reach, and it acts on its own, independently of what the conscious mind decides. Jung was very specific about this. He wrote that complexes behave like independent beings, capable of disturbing the intentions of the will, disturbing memory and the performance of work, and appearing and disappearing according to their own laws. According to their own laws, not yours, not your intentions, not your decision to move on, not your intellectual understanding that he is not good for you. The complex operates beneath that layer, in a register that doesn't receive those announcements. This is why you can know fully, clearly, completely that he is toxic, and still have the thoughts arrive uninvited, because the thoughts aren't coming from the part of you that knows, they're coming from the complex. And the complex doesn't update based on what the conscious mind concluded. Think about what that actually means. Every time you've berated yourself for still thinking about him, every time you felt the shame of catching yourself wondering what he's doing, every time you've looked at the calendar and thought, it's been 6 months, why am I not over this? You are blaming yourself for the behavior of something that isn't under your direct control. Something that operates, by Jung's own clinical definition, according to its own laws. This is layer 1 closing. The loop isn't happening because you haven't tried hard enough. It's not happening because you secretly want to go back. It's not happening because something is permanently broken in you. It's happening because you're dealing with a psychic structure that operates outside the direct reach of conscious will. That's not a metaphor or a poetic way of saying it hurts. That's Jung's clinical description of what a complex is. And it's the same thing modern neuroscience keeps arriving at from a completely different direction. We'll get there. For now, the thoughts that show up on their own, the loop that runs without your permission, the body that reacts before the mind has a chance to intervene. These are not signs that you failed to move on. They're the symptoms of a complex that hasn't yet been given what it needs to dissolve. There's a difference. And the difference matters because it changes everything about what you actually do next. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, because layer 2 isn't just about why the thoughts come back. Layer 2 is about why the bond with this particular person is so much harder to break than a normal heartbreak. And this is the part that gets buried in the self-help conversation, usually under a phrase like, you just need to heal, which says nothing and helps no one. In 1981, 2 researchers named Donald Dutton and Susan Painter published work that would quietly become foundational to understanding what happens in relationships with narcissists. They identified 2 specific conditions that are necessary for a trauma bond to form. Not a normal attachment, a trauma bond, the kind that doesn't follow the rules of ordinary grief. The first condition is a power imbalance in which one person feels increasingly helpless, where the other person's approval or disapproval controls your sense of reality in a way you can't fully see while it's happening. The second condition is intermittent abuse alternating with periods of warmth or positive treatment, not constant abuse. Intermittent abuse, that word intermittent is doing everything here, because the human nervous system is not wired to respond to intermittent reinforcement the way it responds to consistent treatment. Bessel van der Kolk, whose research on trauma and the body has reshaped how we understand what stress actually does to the nervous system, is very direct about this. Humans, like other animals, are more powerfully bound to unpredictable sources of reward than to reliable ones. Think about what that means, concretely, in the context of someone who was sometimes warm, sometimes cold, sometimes everything you needed, and sometimes completely withholding. Sometimes the most attentive person you'd ever met, and sometimes as indifferent as if you were a stranger. Your brain wasn't registering a consistent bad experience that it could file and move past. It was registering something much more neurochemically powerful, an unpredictable source of reward. And when the reward came, those moments of warmth, of feeling seen, of being the one who finally got through to him, of feeling like this was what you've been trying to reach all along, your brain released dopamine more intensely than it would have for any steady, predictable affection. Not because the moments were better, because they were unpredictable. The rare warm moments are encoded harder in memory than the consistent bad ones. Not because you're deceiving yourself about how bad the bad was, because that is what dopamine does with intermittent reward. The brain pays more attention, encodes more deeply when the reward is something it can't predict. It's the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. The occasional win hits harder than consistent small payouts, and this isn't a flaw in your neurology. It's a feature of human neurology that someone who alternates between warmth and withdrawal exploits, intentionally or not, with devastating efficiency, and then you left, or he disappeared, or some combination of both. And the unpredictable source of reward went offline, but the neural circuitry built around it, the dopamine expectation, the hypervigilance for the signal, the anticipatory scanning for the next warm moment, that didn't go offline with him. It kept running, looking for the signal that wasn't coming anymore, wondering, replaying, trying to reconstruct what was real. What did the good moments mean? Is there something I missed? Is there something I could have done differently that would have made the good moments stay? And you still wonder, even now, even knowing what you know. Because the wondering isn't a thought you're choosing. It's the system still searching for a signal it was trained to expect. That's layer 2. And notice what it does to layer 1. Layer 1 said, the loop runs because of a complex that operates outside your will. Layer 2 says, the complex formed on a foundation of neurochemical training that made the bond with this specific person stronger than ordinary attachment through a mechanism that had nothing to do with your judgment or your character. You weren't weak for bonding deeply. You were subject to a process that operates below the level of conscious choice. Both the formation of the bond and the persistence of the loop have mechanisms, real, documented biological mechanisms, and understanding those mechanisms, not just intellectually, but actually sitting with what they mean, is part of what eventually allows the loop to slow down. But we're not there yet, because there's still one more layer. And this is the one nobody talks about. This is the layer that most conversations about narcissistic abuse skip entirely. And it's the skipping of it that explains why so many people find themselves doing the work for years without the loop ever really closing. Here's what I want you to understand. There is a distinction in Jungian psychology and in the clinical literature on trauma and dissociation that's been built on Jung's framework over the past decades, between two very different things that look alike from the outside. The first is abreaction. Abreaction means going back into the experience, revisiting the memory, feeling the feeling again, telling the story again, reliving. The second is integration. Integration means something different, bringing the dissociated material fully into consciousness in a way that allows it to be metabolized, actually digested by the psyche. These sound similar. They are not the same process. And the difference between them is the difference between a wound that keeps reopening and a wound that scars over. Here is the brutal truth that layer 3 carries. Most of what we call processing the narcissist is abreaction, not integration. It's reliving, running the loop, telling the story, to friends, to your journal, to yourself in the car, to a therapist for the 17th time, with the same emotional charge each time, without the loop ever closing. And every time you revisit without integrating, the complex completes another cycle. It gets another rotation. The groove gets a little deeper. The Jungian literature on trauma and dissociation is specific and unambiguous about this. A complex dissolves only when it is lived out to the full, brought completely into consciousness in a way that allows the ego to actually meet it, not suppressed, not endlessly relived without change, met. The therapeutic task is not abreaction. It's not catharsis in the sense of repeating the feeling. It's integration in the sense of the ego standing face to face with what the complex contains and being transformed by that encounter. And here is the diagnostic clue that separates rumination from real dissolution. If you have told the story many times with full emotion in detail and it still carries the same charge and the loop still runs with the same frequency, that is not integration happening slowly. That is the complex continuing to act autonomously, using the act of telling the story as one of its loops. The story is the path the complex has found back to the surface. Telling it again without integrating it teaches the complex that this is the root, and the complex keeps using the root. Now add the neurological layer. Richard McNally and colleagues have documented how chronic stress, the kind sustained over months or years by living under the psychological pressure of a relationship with someone who intermittently threatens your sense of reality, elevates cortisol in ways that disrupt hippocampal function. The hippocampus is the part of the brain responsible for contextualizing memory, for placing experience in time, giving it a "this happened then, it is over, it is in the past" quality. When the hippocampus is chronically stressed, memories don't encode with that contextual frame. They encode in fragments, sensory pieces, emotional charges, body responses, without the narrative coherence that the brain normally uses to file something as resolved, which means the brain's ordinary mechanism for marking experience as complete and past is not working the way it should for these specific memories. Every time the memory of him surfaces, it surfaces without the timestamp. Without the "this was then," it surfaces as present and as a live signal the system is still trying to process. The hippocampus can't file it as done because the encoding was fragmented by the cortisol that ran through you for months while the relationship was happening. This is not a character flaw, this is biology that was disrupted by prolonged stress. And it completes the picture of why the complex is autonomous in the way Jung described. Because the neurological mechanism that would normally allow the psyche to mark an experience as finished and move past it has been compromised by the conditions of the relationship itself. The relationship, by its nature, created the biological conditions for the loop to persist after the relationship ended. Now go back for a second to that phrase from the beginning. You know exactly what he is, and the thoughts still show up on their own. You have been hearing that as evidence that something is wrong with you. That knowing and still feeling means you haven't truly accepted the truth. That healing should have arrived automatically once the intellectual understanding came. But look at it through everything we've just gone through. Thoughts that show up on their own. That is the description of an autonomous complex. Thoughts that operate according to their own laws. Thoughts that surface without permission and return without invitation. You weren't failing to move on. You were describing with perfect accuracy exactly what Jung spent years documenting and naming. A nucleus of charged emotional experience that became autonomous, formed through real events combined with a nervous system trained by intermittent reinforcement and encoded in a hippocampus disrupted by chronic cortisol. The layer 1 thought said, "Something is wrong with me." The layer 3 truth says, something real happened to your nervous system, to your hippocampus, to your psychic structure, and it created something autonomous that has real properties and real needs. It is not evidence of weakness, it is evidence of what happened. You were right about what you were feeling. You were wrong about what it meant, and that matters enormously, because what it means changes what actually helps. The super thanks button on this video is one of the ways this channel stays independent enough to go into places like this, into Jung's actual texts, into the clinical research on trauma bonding, into the neuroscience that most conversations about narcissistic abuse never touch. If layer 3 landed for you today, if something shifted in how you understand what's happening in you, that button is how you say so. It keeps this work going. Here's what integration actually looks like, as opposed to reliving. Integration in the Jungian framework doesn't mean going back into the story one more time with more emotion. It means bringing the complex into consciousness in a way the ego can actually meet, standing in front of what the complex contains rather than being carried by it. It means the difference between being inside the memory and observing the memory from a position of full awareness. And that shift from being inside to observing requires something specific. It requires asking different questions than the ones the loop asks. The loop asks, what did it mean that he said that? Was any of it real? Could it have been different if I had responded differently? These questions don't close. They can't close because they're trying to resolve the complex using the same mode of consciousness that was running when the complex formed. The loop is the complex trying to answer its own questions, and the complex doesn't have the tools to answer them. That's why it keeps running. The questions that move something are different. They turn inward instead of outward. They ask, what part of me does this complex speak for? What was I hungry for before he arrived? What need was already unmet, already aching, that his intermittent warmth touched? What did those rare good moments feel like to that part of me? What did they feel like to a part that had been in some way waiting for exactly that? Be honest with yourself for a second, because the nuclear element of the complex, what Jung identified as the core around which everything else constellates, is never only about the other person. The other person triggered it, the relationship gave it its current shape, but the charge, the ache, the hunger that made the intermittent warmth hit so hard, that was already in you before he arrived. That's not an accusation. It's the most useful thing I know how to say about where the work actually opens. I remember the night I finally understood this in relation to my own life. I was in my kitchen, different city, years later, reading Jung's description of the complex as a splinter of the psyche, capable of acting like a second personality with its own logic and its own emotional needs. And I thought about that argument I kept replaying from my marriage, and I realized for the first time that what that memory kept returning to wasn't really about my ex-wife at all. It was about something the argument had touched in me, a very specific fear about being seen and found insufficient, that had been there long before her. She didn't create it, she revealed it, and the complex had been circling around the reveal ever since, trying to resolve something she had nothing to do with. That was the moment the loop began to slow down. Not because I understood it intellectually, I had understood it intellectually for years, but because I finally turned toward the thing the complex was actually about, rather than the person it had attached itself to. Integration is when consciousness finally catches up to what the complex has been trying to say all along. Not what he did, what it meant to a part of you that was already, in some way, waiting to feel exactly that. The empath who can't forget isn't stuck because she loved too much. She's stuck because a part of her psyche formed a complex around an experience that was never integrated, only relived. And reliving is not healing. Reliving is the complex running another loop. Healing is when consciousness finally meets what the complex contains, when the part that's been trying to finish something gets the full, unhurried attention it's been demanding. That's what changes the loop. Not willpower, not time alone, not understanding who he is or naming what he did. Not even talking about it one more time with one more person. What changes it is turning toward the complex with the kind of consciousness that can actually metabolize it. Present, honest, willing to be uncomfortable, willing to find out what was already there before he arrived. The loop is not punishment, it is not evidence of brokenness, it is a part of you still trying to complete something. And completion, real completion, requires that what was fragmented finally find its way into the full light of awareness and be seen for what it actually is. You were not weak, you were unfinished, and unfinished has a different exit than broken does. Tell me something in the comments, and be honest, when you finally understood what was happening to you in that relationship, was it the factual knowledge that moved something first? Or was it an emotional recognition, something that landed below the level of words? Because I've noticed that most people find that knowing the facts, knowing the clinical name, knowing the pattern, doesn't actually close the loop. What does something to the loop is usually a moment of emotional recognition, the moment it stops being a story about him and becomes a story about a part of you that needed something. If that happened for you, or if layer 3 today was the first time something landed differently, I want to know. Tell me which layer hit hardest.